Hello and welcome to the summary of The Winter King, which is the first of 3 books in the Warlord Chronicles about the adventures of King Arthur. Well, he's not King Arthur yet in the first book, and obviously the rest of the characters of Dumonia, or as we know it, Camelot. I haven't read books 2 and 3, but in the first book, the backdrop is this ongoing battle between the Britons, our main protagonists, and then the Saxons and the Franks. In this book, we find out how King Arthur came to be a protector of the realm type character, his meeting with Guinevere, and we get a few random appearances from Merlin. So many of the reviews for this book were really positive, and it's a favorite of many people, but I just found it okay. I'm very much in the minority though, so I'm going to recommend it based on everybody else absolutely loving it. The writing was excellent, it was an enjoyable book, but I wasn't quite captured by it. What drew me to this book was one of my all-time favorite poems, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So I thought it would be fun to get back into a little bit more Arthurian literature. Also, there's a TV adaptation of this book, which is coming out this month. I always really like seeing a visual representation of the books that I read. Even if that TV show or movie isn't great, it doesn't ruin an experience of reading the book for me. But I think I would have liked a darker The Green Knight aesthetic. Anyway, that's going to be coming out next week or the week after, and I'm definitely going to be checking it out. Anyway, yeah, I guess on to the summary.
At a time before England was known as England, we find ourselves in a monastery there. Our narrator, Derfel, lives in this monastery with his brethren and their bishop Sansom. There is a semi-regular visitor to the monastery, Queen Igraine. She's married to King Brochfel. She comes to the monastery to pray for her son, but she also talks to the narrator Derfel because she likes his stories about King Arthur. He writes these accounts of Arthur, enemy of God, but he lies to Sansom, the bishop. He says instead that he's writing down translations of the gospel in the tongue of the enemy Saxons. Since the bishop couldn't understand that language or read, he was none the wiser. Derfel tells us about how Arthur's story began in the last year of High King Uther's reign in Britain. It was a bitterly cold night when Princess Norwenna, daughter-in-law to the king, screamed in the great halls of Caer Cardan. She was in the process of giving birth to the heir. Uther was old and sick at this time, having lost his beloved son Mordred, who was killed in one of the many battles against the Saxons. It's Mordred's widow, Norwenna, who is about to give birth to this new heir. Unless she gives birth to a girl, then the kingdom would be doomed. Norwenna was a Christian and had insisted on a Christian birth. The king, who wasn't, granted her this, but he was getting annoyed with the priests chanting their prayers. Derfel was there at the time. He was an errand boy or a young man, originally from Widron, which is Merlin's hall. Norwenna's labor was not going well, the baby wouldn't come, and it looked like Norwenna's life was in jeopardy. The king waved the risk to Norwenna's life off. The most important thing to him was the baby. Morgan was summoned then by the king to help with the labor. Remember we first encountered Morgan Le Fay in the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? Well, Morgan was the king's daughter, and she'd learned her skills from Merlin. Since Merlin had been gone for months, Morgan took his place, even though the king would have preferred Merlin. Her witchcraft worked though, because Norwenna gave birth to her child and they both survived the birth. All the omens around the child's birth were bad though. Morgan also tells the king that the newborn is crippled, he has a twisted foot, and he'll never be able to run. And when they placed Norwenna's afterbirth on the fire, it didn't crackle, it was completely silent. The crackling signaled how many more children a mother would have. The king announces that they have a duty to protect the boy, who he named Mordred. The king decided that the child would go with Morgan to Wyn's Widron with his mother. Wyn's Widron means the Isle of Glass, and this was Merlin's realm. Though it wasn't actually an island, it was a piece of higher ground with thick reeds and bogs. Merlin's hall was built on the steepest and highest hill at its summit called Tor. Merlin was a druid, and Britain had once been land of the Druids, but after the Romans came, they stamped this out, and now only a handful of old Druids remained. Christians had taken their place. Anyway, Norwenna and baby Mordred were to become Morgan's wards. Derfel talks about the other children at Tor, whom Merlin believed would grow into a new order of Druids and priestesses, who could help him then re-establish the old, true religion in Rome-bliced Britain. Derfel himself was actually Saxon, but he had been raised in Britain, so he saw the Saxons as enemies, and he was loyal to the Britons. One of Mordred's chief guards was a Christian named Lichizuk, who knew the story of the king's son Mordred's death. It goes as follows. The king summoned Arthur and his men to help defeat some Saxons. Arthur brought his warriors, but there was no time to find enough ships for both men and horses, so there were no horses, but they didn't actually need the horses because they had the Saxons trapped. The men should have waited for Arthur's instructions, but Prince Mordred, who wanted recognition, ordered them to charge at the Saxons. They were soundly defeated by the Saxons, and as they lay there, killed or about to be killed, Arthur and his men showed up. Ligesak then set the record straight about the rumours of Mordred's supposed heroic acts. The bards tell you that Mordred glutted the ground with Saxon blood that day, lad, but it wasn't Mordred, it was Arthur. He killed and killed. This, by the way, all happened at the Battle of the White Horse. And that's why the Saxons are being cautious neighbours, boy. Not because Mordred beat them, but because they think Arthur has come back to Britain. At the time, though, Arthur hadn't returned. The king had banished him because he thought that he wanted Mordred dead so that he, Arthur, could be king. They were both Uther's sons, but Mordred was the beloved and Arthur the bastard. That spring, the High Council was held in the Roman town of Glenvim. This was the first one held in Britain in over 60 years. The future of the kingdom, Norwenna, and baby Mordred would be decided, and the High King would preside over it. Uther looked gross and ill, his body swollen with fluid, his face was yellowing and slack, his breathing laboured. It was here that Derfal saw Sansom as a young priest for the first time. After some deliberations, Sansom's sermon, discussion of other kingdom matters, the king finally attended to the most important issue of Dumonia, which is their territory. A territory that he said could not fall to the Saxons because if it did, then all of Britain, divided, would fall. The Saxons must not reach the Severn Sea, and if they were hemmed in by the Britons, then there was a chance that they could one day be driven back into the German Sea. He announced that his kingdom would be for his grandson Mordred to rule when he dies. Mordred, Uther said, would have 3 sworn protectors, men bound by death oaths, to defend the boy's life. King Tedwick of Gwent was one, Owain, the champion of Dumonia, was the second, and Merlin, Lord of Avalon, the third. Nimue, who was one of the children who grew up in Merlin's home and who had eventually become his young lover, was a young woman who was also at the council, and she suddenly went into a trance, and she suggested that Merlin also wanted Arthur to be the child's protector. The king was sure that Nimue spoke for Merlin, and so he agreed. Thus, as the High Council ended, was Arthur, son of nobody, chosen to be one of Mordred's sworn protectors. Norwenna and King Gunlius of Siluria were married 2 weeks after the High Council, and she became Queen Norwenna of Cerulia. But she did return to Winswydran, and Gunlius went back to his own country. That summer, Uther, the High King, died. Arthur stayed in the south. He said that his men would die of boredom if he brought his famed soldiers to peaceful Dumonia. However, he was summoned after the king's death. A flag was also raised above Merlin's hall to signify the kingdom having a new king, Mordred. He wasn't a proper king, though, until he was carried to Caer Cardan and proclaimed with the sword. When Gunlius returned victorious from war, Norwenna was happy to see him, and he asked her to kiss the sword that would protect her son. She kissed the sword as she had been commanded, but just as her lips touched the grey steel, Gunlius rammed the blade hard down. He was laughing as he killed his bride, laughing as he slid the sword down past her chin into the hollow of her throat, and still laughing as he forced the long blade down through the choking resistance of her writhing body. Norwenna had no time to scream, nor any voice left to scream with, as the blade ripped through her throat and was rammed down to her heart. After this, Gunlius killed baby Mordred. Ligesak, one of Mordred's men, had joined the Silurian ranks, and he helped the spearmen massacre his own men. Few of the Dumonians tried to fight, but the Silurian spearmen made brief work of Mordred's guard, and even briefer work still of Druidan's sorry soldiers. It seemed that Gunlius wanted the throne of Dumonia for himself. Gunlius and the Silurians ransacked Merlin's home as the inhabitants tried to flee. Derfal refused to leave without his love, Nimue, who was trying to protect Merlin's secrets. The soldiers assaulted her, took one of her eyes and left her for dead. They also set fire to the place. Derfel, however, managed to find her and take her with him on his escape. Later, when Derfel catches up with Morgan and the rest of the people who got away, she reveals that the baby that Gunlius killed was a decoy. It wasn't baby Mordred. The baby, heir apparent, was still alive. He wasn't safe yet though. Soon, Gunlius would see that he killed a baby with 2 perfect feet, and he'd realize that he'd been fooled. They weren't safe, so they decided to walk to Caer Cardan. They reached Caer Cardan, but Gunlius still held the advantage. We were 12 horsemen, 50 spearmen, and 30 tired fugitives who were gathered in an open place where Gunlius had gathered almost twice as many horsemen and twice as many spearmen. He first asked for the child, saying that if the people gave Mordred to him, he would leave. The 2 sides readied themselves for battle, both gassing each other up, but before they got to any fighting, a horn sounded 3 times. Arthur had returned to Dumonia at last. In the present, Queen Igraine is impatient for more stories of Arthur's childhood and about the sword and the stone. Their place in the tale, Derfel says, is still far ahead. The sword was called Caledfwich, which means hard lighting, though Igraine prefers to call it Excalibur, and Derfel says that he will call it that too, because Arthur never cared about the name that his sword carried. Arthur's mother was called Igraine. She came from Caer Gae in Gwynedd, and she was said to have been the daughter of Cunedda, King of Gwynedd and High King before Uther. Besides what Uther said, even though he called Arthur a bastard, Arthur was still his son. Anyway, when Arthur's mother died of a fever, Arthur was sent to Caer Cardan, where he learned to use a sword and spear at court. There, he grew to be a great soldier. So in his retelling, Derfel left out something. The fact that their side, the side of Dumonia against Gunlius, had known that Arthur and his men were on their way, that they had just newly arrived from Brittany, but in order to keep the readers and the listeners of the story in suspense, he kept that bit about Arthur's arrival for the last minute. Anyway, back to this battle. Some men escaped, but most of Gunlius's men were captured. He was taken alive. Arthur, who was 26 years old at the time, fell to his knees before the baby king and greeted his sister Morgan. He went over to Gunlius then and drew Excalibur, but much to the surprise of everybody in the crowd, he didn't kill him, instead saying that it wasn't in his oath to kill kings, so Gunlius would be held captive until a decision was made about what to do with him. In the meantime, he would be placed under guard in a chamber off the great hall of Caer Cardan. During the evening's feast, Derfel noticed the graceful Aileen, Arthur's slave and lover. Arthur was also the father of twin boys with Aileen, Amar and Loholt, and Arthur worshipped those boys. Arthur and Aileen had been happily together for 10 years, but it was understood or rumored that Arthur would eventually send her away and marry somebody royal, just like his father sent his mother away to marry his royal match. Arthur led a party of horsemen to Wintridren the next day and returned that evening to report that Merlin's settlement had been burned to the ground. He declared his intention to rebuild it, even though the resources were so scarce. One of the men, Mordred's champion, Owain, explained to Derfel then how Merlin had given Excalibur to Arthur. Caledfwich? I asked, using Excalibur's proper name. You didn't know? Owain asked in astonishment. Caledfwich, Owain explained to me, was forged in the other worlds by Goffernon. Goffernon was the god of smithcraft. Merlin found it in Ireland. He won it off a druid in a dream contest. The Irish druids say that when the sword's wearer is in desperate trouble, he can thrust the sword into the soil, and Goffernon would leave the other world and come to his help. Owain was perplexed about why Merlin gave the sword to Arthur though, because Arthur didn't believe in the gods. Owain and his men went off then, killing Saxons and setting their villages alight. Derfel was in Owain's group, involved in this killing spree. He was still a young man following orders though, and it's not like he killed anybody who didn't try to kill him. Still, he knew his involvement in this military campaign was sinful. By the time Mordred was 1 year old and about to be acclaimed as king, the troubles in Dumonia came to a head. But back to the ceremony, acclaiming him as king. Bishop Bedwin said a prayer to the Christian god. Then the baby king was paraded around the outside of the stone circle. Mordred had been laid upon a war shield and swathed in fur, and it was thus he was shown to all the warriors, chiefs, and princes who, as the baby passed, dropped to their knees to pay him homage. A grown king would have walked about the circle, but 2 Dumonian warriors carried Mordred. while behind the child, with his long sword drawn, paced Owain, the king's champion. Gifts were presented to the baby, and nobody objected to him being declared king. There was one last ritual that the council wanted performed. Arthur walked away as a captured Saxon was brought out, and Owain thrust a spear into him. Then Morgan went to him and told him that King Mordred would have a long life and he would be leader of battle, and he will know victory. That evening, at the feast, Tristan of Cernor arrived and drew his sword, saying that he had a quarrel, and that there would be blood between his country and Mordred's if he did not receive justice. "A group of my father's people," Tristan said, "were given protection by High King Uther. They came to this country at Uther's request to work the mines and live in peace with their neighbors. Yet last summer, some of those neighbors came to their mine and gave them sword, fire, and slaughter. 58 dead. Things started to get rowdy as Arthur said that if any man drew blood that night, they were his enemy. A small child came forward then and gave testimony about how her family was killed, and that the one man who killed them had a picture of a dragon and a boar on his arms. The child looked at Owain then and said that the man also had rings in his beard. Obviously, Owain denied this. Arthur found Derfel and told him that he won't ask Derfel to break his oath, but they do talk about the meaning of war and what it means to be a soldier. Then Arthur tells him that there's going to be peace anyway, because he will marry King Guffred's daughter, Cynwyn, to pacify Siluria, and then the Saxons will face a united Britain. Powys, Gwent, Dumonia, and Siluria, all embracing each other, all fighting the same enemy, and all at once peace with one another. Tristan returned the next morning, wanting to know what would come of the man who did the killing. Owain and Arthur had decided that they would fight. As Arthur says, the accused should be punished, and Owain accepts the challenge. They fight, and Arthur eventually stabs Owain, his guts spilling onto the ground. After this death, Tristan accepts that the judgment was fair. Arthur then assumed responsibility of administrative affairs of Dumonia, and he was the new king's champion. He had quite some power in Dumonia, becoming a protector of the realm type character. Then Arthur and Cynwyn were formally betrothed, and they did make a very happy looking pair, but it was on that happy night, when peace had come at last, that Arthur broke Britain. During the festivities, someone caught Arthur's eye. With her cascade of red hair tumbling in tangles, none were as unforgettable as Guinevere. According to Derfel, Merlin had said that it would have been better had she been drowned at birth. Try as he might, Arthur could not take his eyes off Guinevere. He walked and talked with Cynwyn, but he could not wait to spend time with Guinevere, who knew this, and she tantalized him. He burned for Guinevere. On the second night of the feast, they spoke and laughed for hours. He was possessed. He thought about her, talked about her, dreamed of her, and could not live without her. Yet somehow, agonizingly, he kept up with the pretense of his betrothal to Cynwyn. But Arthur wore Guinevere's hair about his neck. It was a narrow red braid that he hid beneath his collar. Everybody hoped that Arthur would get over this madness, but it wasn't to be. At one point, Arthur went into the woods to meet Guinevere and told the priest that he should marry them there and then. But Sansom refused, telling Arthur that he was already betrothed. It would seem that Sansom had agreed to marry them the night before, though, and he said that his conscience now wouldn't allow it. Arthur asked him what he wanted, what it would take for him to marry them, and Sansom listed his wishes. "Give me a church, Lord, and a throne in the church, and men will call me bishop, and the appointment to be King Mordred's chaplain, with an allowance and some staff, and a place on Dumonia's council." Arthur recklessly granted all of these wishes. Guinevere was very poor, so she was pleased at being able to marry way above her station. She was also betrothed to somebody else, Valerian of Powys, and he challenged Arthur to a fight, but Arthur refused. So Arthur had his summer of love, and there was some peace. His sons were brought to the household, but Guinevere didn't take a liking to the twins, so she had them sent off. She said that the twins belonged to Arthur's old life, and if they wanted children, they could have their own. So the twins were sent back to their mother. By the autumn, Arthur saw the damage that he had done. He sent an apology to Cynwyn and her father, and with it some pearls for her. He had written in the note that he wanted there to be peace in Britain. However, King Gorfodid, Cynwyn's father, wasn't so forgiving, and he returned the necklace on the severed neck of the servant messenger. He took the reins back from his son, and he swore that his daughter would be avenged. Things were looking grim throughout the kingdom. Most armies were greasing their weapons, and war was brewing. Back to the present, Igraine really wants to know what it is that attracted Arthur to Guinevere. Was she beautiful? No, Derfel tells her, but women would trade their beauty for Guinevere's look. One look at her and Arthur's blood turned to smoke. She challenged him, and he would have felt less of a man if he failed to capture her. He also didn't mean that she wasn't beautiful. He just meant that she was more than beautiful. We also learn here, by the way, that Dumonia was now called Camelot, and Igraine refers to it as Camelot, because that's how it's written in the poems and songs by the bards. Arthur hated to be reminded of those early days in Dumonia where his passion for Guinevere tore the land into chaos. He blamed himself and didn't like to talk about the bad years. During a private talk between Guinevere and Derfel, she had spoken a kind of treasonous way about King Mordred, saying that Arthur would make a better king, and Derfel did reluctantly agree with that assessment. Anyway, the men took off to another battle by ship to Benoic, south of the sea. Arthur had put Derfel in charge of this mission. Derfel had become quite a worthy soldier by this point, even though some found him rather young. The men reached Innistrabis, and their task was to defend this territory by fighting on the mainland of Benoic, where the Franks were pushing into the farmlands that supported the lavish capital. But before all of this, Derfel had to meet the king. He met then with King Ban of Benoic, and he told the king that he had been sent there because the kingdom is under siege. King Ban had hoped for 300 men, but Arthur could only spare 60. Then Derfel met King Ban's son, Prince Lancelot, who sneered at him because of his age and the small number of men. Lancelot felt insulted by Arthur. During the feast that night, Lancelot challenged Derfel. He teased Derfel about being a child, and Derfel eventually lost his patience, hit Lancelot, and caused him to fall to the floor. He choked them then, and eventually Lancelot walked away with a bloody lip. He did eventually publicly apologize to Lancelot, though. Anyway, the men, including a soldier named Galahad, who would go on to become Derfel's best friend over the years, went on to fight their battles for 2 years, and not once did Derfel see Lancelot. Even though there were stories of him and his heroic feats, he actually spent the war begging his mother to bring him wine and honey. Even when he was at a fight, he'd be way in the back so that he'd be the first one back home to talk of his victory. We get pages and pages of fighting then, and this fighting goes on for 2 years. Derfel mentions that Lancelot was often named as the hero of the Battle of Benoic, not Galahad or Derfel himself, who were actually in the trenches. By the way, Galahad is also Lancelot's half-brother. He is the other son of King Ban. So even though central Benoic was fortified, things weren't looking good because the Franks were deep in the woods on the hills of central Benoic. Derfel, Galahad and his men couldn't hold off the Franks forever. They were drawing close, and Arthur was off fighting the Saxons, so he was unable to come to their aid, even though he did send another small group of men. Ban's kingdom was crumbling. There were Franks everywhere, and most of the people of Benoic had already fled. Lancelot was named commander of the city, and of course he was an incompetent leader, and eventually the Franks swarmed into the city, and the city was lost. Galahad and Derfel tried to get to Ban's palace, trying to outrun the Franks. The guards were gone from the courtyard. The palace doors lay open, and inside, where women cowered and children cried, the beautiful furniture waited for the conquerors. The curtains stirred in the wind. The king was still there, still in his toga, and still at his table with a quill in his hand. "It's too late," he said. Derfel went into the library, and that's where he saw the priest Kelwin, who was trying to pull more scrolls off the shelves, as Derfel and Galahad were fending off attacks from the Franks. Turns out, though, that this priest was actually Merlin in disguise. They then made their way out of the palace and across the water, and left the fallen city behind. They took with them a chest that Merlin said was the real treasure that Ban possessed. A scroll containing the only record of the old Druid religion, all its secrets, all of its rituals, all its meaning, and all of its power. Remember, Druids aren't allowed to write anything of their religion down. It was against the rules. Anyway, this was what Merlin was off searching for. They made it back to Dumonia, and stories were told about their battle with the Franks and how King Ban, clinging to hope, refused to leave the palace. It's at the end of part 3 where Derfel finds out that his love Nimue has also been sent to a place called the Isle of the Dead. In the present day, Queen Igraine questions Derfel's account of Lancelot being a coward. He could be brave, I said, but he chose not to be. He fought sometimes, but usually he avoided battle. He was frightened of his face being scarred, you see. He was very vain about his looks. He collected Roman mirrors. The mirrored room in Benoic's palace was Lancelot's room. He could sit there and admire himself on every wall. Back to the story. Derfel decided to go to the Isle of the Dead, a place where the lost and mad go, kind of like a leper's island / purgatory, to find Nimue, his lost love. He finds her there, looking quite unkempt and feral, but they are reunited and she eventually recognizes him. They eventually made their way back home, where Derfel nursed Nimue back to health, and they went back to the Tor, which had since been rebuilt. Things were still troubling on the home front. A Saxon leader named Ayela grows stronger. So strong that he even dares call himself Bretwalda. Bedouin shuddered at the barbarous pretension. Bretwalda was a Saxon title and meant ruler of Britain. He captured all the land between Durocobrivis and Corinium, Bedouin told me. And he probably would have captured both those fortresses if we hadn't purchased peace with the last of our gold. Then there's a leader, Cerdic, in the south, and he's proving even more vicious than Ayela. Ayela did not attack Powys because Gorfodid paid him in gold, just like we did. Gorfodid is doing what Arthur hoped to do, uniting the tribes, but sadly it's uniting them against us and not against the Saxons. Gorfodid was also collecting an army at this time. He wanted Arthur dead because of what Arthur did to his daughter Cynwyn. Arthur's death would be his terms for peace. Anyway, the treasuries were strapped, so they couldn't pay off the Saxons. Eventually they did get some gold from Sansom's church, against Sansom's will, and they went to meet the Saxon king Bretwalda, or Ayela. They rode to Gorfodid's fortress, and he wasn't willing to listen to reason. His quarrel was with Arthur. Just then, Merlin came in, and everybody sank to their knees. Even Gorfodid lowered his sword. Merlin made the point that just when they were finally free from Roman rule, now they were fighting amongst themselves and letting the Saxons win. He also announced that he needed help with another mission. The Ring of Eluned, he announced grandly, is one of the 13 treasures of Britain. We've always known about the treasures, of course, at least those of us who recognize the true gods. The ring commands the gods, but not on its own. Rather, along with some other treasures. The 13th treasure is missing, the cauldron of Clydno Aiden. Without the cauldron, they were lost. Merlin wanted to bring all these 13 treasures together to restore Britain. Eventually, at the end of the book, there was one final battle where Nimue led the men into the meadow, into battle. Both Arthur and Merlin joined the battle, and Arthur and his men are victorious. Gorfodid is killed in battle, and all Arthur wants is King Gundlius' head and peace between all Britons. He publicly apologizes to Cynwyn, and she says that she holds no grudge against him. He also then asks everybody if they can fight the new Saxons, who are still a threat, together. Nimue and Derfel find Gundlius, and finally Nimue is about to get her revenge as Gundlius screams. And that is the end of The Winter King. Thank you for watching.